Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm your host, Ben Plumley, and this is a podcast about global health and human rights. And this week, we are following closely the AIDS 2020 virtual conference and the HIV 2020 conferences. And I'm absolutely honored to be joined by one of the leaders in the global fight against AIDS, Chris Collins, who is president of Friends of the Global Fight over in Washington, D.C. Chris, welcome back to a Shot in the Arm podcast.
Thank you, Ben. It's good to be back.
It's really great to have you here. Now, for some of our viewers and listeners who don't know the work of Friends of the Fight, could you just tell us a little bit about what you guys do?
Our central role is to encourage U.S. government support for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. So we work very hard with the administration and members of Congress and other advocates and the public to advance U.S. support of the Global Fund. But we really think about that very holistically. So we're strong advocates with others in the community for our bilateral global health programs, including PEPFAR and the President's Emergency, President's Malaria Initiative and the TB program at USAID, and really the whole global health portfolio. We work strongly with the community to increase U.S. investment in global health overall.
So I imagine this has been a really busy time for you these last few months. What have you been up to in and around DC?
Well, it has been crazy and tragic in many ways, and just trying to follow how COVID is unfolding, both in our country, but then around the world. We're very concerned about COVID in itself, but also the potential damage that COVID could do to the AIDS, TB, and malaria responses. Really could potentially double mortality in those three diseases over the coming year. And we've seen so many signs of it already. This isn't just modeling or conjecture. You've seen case reporting of tuberculosis fall precipitously in countries around the world. And that's just because people are afraid to come forward for testing. You've seen fewer people come forward in South Africa to pick up antiretrovirals to treat HIV, and national malaria programs undermined because of lockdowns and not being able to get bed nets and other commodities to families. So it's very concerning. We're following that closely, and related to all that is what's the U.S. angle on that, and clearly. We really need the U.S., the Congress to step up with support for the global response on COVID as well as the domestic response. I can say more about that if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain irony, isn't there? The United States at the forefront of projecting public health around the world, and now we have an epidemic really out of proportion compared to other countries. But Chris, I really wanted to ask you, last year you, I think, played a really critical role in getting sustained US support for the Global Fund's next tranche of funding. It was called the Global Fund Replenishment, and it was a huge achievement. Are you worried that some of that funding could be diverted to cover COVID costs? And actually, maybe I should ask the question a slightly different way. Should some of that funding even be diverted to pay for COVID-related costs?
No, would be the short answer. I mean, I think the pandemic of COVID is an opportunity to realize that we need to be investing more money in global health now, certainly, but on an ongoing basis as well. In terms of the U.S. support, the whole community really rallied last year to get the increase in the U.S. allocation to the Global Fund and from donors around the world. For this year, I feel a certain degree of confidence that Congress is going to maintain our investment in the Global Fund. That's at $1.56 billion a year. That's what we're set to do. In fact, really encouraged that the House just posted its State Foreign Operations Subcommittee bill yesterday, and they'll go to markup today. But in that bill, they are sustaining the 1.56 billion level for the Global Fund, and even giving some emergency funding to the Global Fund that would be COVID specific. I think the Senate, my hope is that the Senate will do the same in terms of maintaining the core U.S. allocation. The real question, I think, for advocates now, too, certainly is not to take that core allocation for granted, but also we really need substantial investment from the United States just around COVID. And for the Global Fund, I mean, I think the Global Fund has an essential role to play here in terms of mitigating the damage against the AIDS, TB, and malaria responses. So more funding is needed for that as you adapt those programs to be successful in a COVID environment. But in addition, I think the Global Fund is one of those organizations that can help more generally in terms of getting personal protective equipment out to community healthcare workers, delivering COVID-related diagnostics, and one day when we have them, getting therapeutics out to people. And then, of course, Gavi is going to have a huge role when we have a vaccine and getting that out. But right now is the time for the Congress to step forward, and the supplemental they're working on in July, and hopefully pass in July or early August, that really includes a sizable investment in global health, and includes what we're asking for, which is $4 billion for COVID-specific activity through the Global Fund for over a 2-year period. So that's our ask on the supplemental, in addition to the core funding at $1.56 billion.
And it's great, in a sense, to have a vehicle like the Global Fund that can provide centralized procurement and provide funding to countries so they can implement it and use it where's needed. It sort of begs the question, really, whether, this is going to be a bit cheeky, whether, in a sense, the United States itself couldn't become a beneficiary of the Global Fund. I mean, how would we love to have some centralized direction and support, and certainly some centralized procurement of PPE?
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, the point, the reason to fund the Global Fund now and Gavi and the other international agencies that are responding is so that there are not waiting lines for testing, there's not waiting lines for therapeutics, and all those community health workers and all community health workers can get adequate protection. It's mystifying that hasn't been available in our own country. I don't understand how that's broken down, but I do know that if we don't do better in Global Fund recipient countries in terms of making those things available, that you're looking at absolute disaster. So we really need the financing in the short term to get that to the ground and protect health workers and protect the AIDS, TB, malaria responses.
I think one of the other great things about the Global Fund is that it creates that sense of global solidarity, and takes away from a nationalism or a particular country first. And as we're seeing with the United States, essential total block purchase of the early drug treatment remdesivir, we need to make sure that future treatments and certainly vaccines, when they become available, are made available in a sustainable, solidarity-driven way. Do you see the Global Fund and Gavi being able to work together to achieve that?
Absolutely. I've really been impressed, I have to say. I'm not just saying this, but I do think the international community came together on the ACT Accelerator, for example, under the chapeau of the World Health Organization, to really think about how they're going to coordinate access to diagnostics and to treatments and vaccines, and then do other things to shore up the health system. You've really seen the different entities, from Unitaid to Gavi to Global Fund, WHO, other Gates Foundation, others really come together in a systematic way to think about how they're going to do that in an equitable way. One of the immediate term things is to get that money. We need the U.S. Congress to step forward, but we're also really going to need other donors to come forward and make the funding available as soon as possible. But then it is that coordination function and making sure, we don't have, for example, like we've had in the United States, this tragic situation of states bidding against states to get, basics. We have to avoid that on an international level too, to make sure countries aren't bidding against countries, and that isn't undermining access. And I'm hopeful that we're seeing a coordinated response on a global level to get ready for this.
And talk about coordinated response. I think the EU, battered by Britain's Brexit and what's going on in Poland and Hungary, but it really has, pardon me, stepped to the fore. And, the president of the EC, Ursula von der Leyen, has led these extraordinary fundraisers, both for vaccine research, but also critically for the WHO. And I wonder whether you see the growing leadership of the European Union as perhaps just a band-aid for the moment, or whether it's something that, is a reality that we need to embrace and understand moving forward.
It's a really fascinating question, and it's not clear how all this works. At a time of rising nationalism all over the world, we saw last year Global Fund replenishment be enormously successful, raise more money for a multilateral health agency than ever in history in the midst of this, nationalism trend. And then, you saw that again with Gavi replenishment that happened very recently. They did extremely well too. So it's interesting that even as populations and governments and many government leaders are turning inward, you are seeing the international community rally in terms of the financing piece on Global Fund and Gavi. And now, European Union, as you say, has already stepped up in a big way on the COVID response. We are going to need a lot more money in the COVID response. We're really just starting there in terms of the fundraising on COVID. Billions more is going to be needed. I was really encouraged. Global Citizen had an event recently that was quite successful. Very encouraged to see Germany step forward with funding across the board on COVID, but in particular for the Global Fund, Global Fund COVID-19 response mechanism. That's great to see. It's a start. We've seen global solidarity around global health happen even in the midst of nationalism, and we just need to continue that. I think one thing to ask is, why is that happening? And I think with Global Fund and Gavi, you're really seeing entities that have a lot of credibility because they're very highly results oriented, accountable. They report, what their results are, and Global Fund, for example, has a really strong oversight function. So I think those results oriented entities that are showing concrete results are the kinds of things that we're seeing international donors being willing to continue to invest in, even as they wrestle with nationalism.
So you mentioned Gavi and you mentioned the Global Fund. What about WHO, the sort of foundation, if you like, of the post-World War II international health infrastructure? Do you see a long-term recommitment from the United States coming? You mentioned the congressional bill that included a major reinvestment in WHO. Do you think the US can go it alone without WHO?
No, I think WHO is absolutely critical to all this. And I think you're seeing, and just as what I was talking about, you're seeing them bring the players together on COVID-19 in a way that nobody else can. I mean, to paraphrase Voltaire, if the WHO didn't exist, we'd need to create it. So, I think if efforts to take a look at how it can be improved are great. Every entity, there's room for improvement in every entity, every organization. That's certainly true with the WHO. But it's going to play a central role in COVID. It already is. I think the administration and its attitude towards WHO is one thing. WHO has a lot of support in Congress. I think in the short run, that will be, we'll see what the United States does. I'm hopeful that in the longer term, the United States and policymakers really come to realize that even our own interests in global health, if you just look at what the U.S. is involved in terms of TB and so many other areas, we're absolutely reliant on the WHO to make our programming work. So, and in fact, weeks ago when there was first talk about U.S. defunding of the Global Fund, one of the first things that happened was you had USAID reach out and try to get a limitation on that because we're dependent on WHO collaboration. So I think that appreciation is growing, and in the long run, I think we'll get to the right place.
Well, on a positive note, Chris, maybe all of this attention on COVID, rightly, we're in the middle of an extraordinary global pandemic, has forced us to rethink about the global health security agenda and the role in which infectious disease has to play a more central role in the overall strategy. What's your sense of how we turn this into a moment of opportunity?
So, I think we need to scale up investment and services to respond to the emergency. But I also think everybody's also thinking longer term. How does all that is happening now serve as an inflection point where we kind of reassess the ways that we've been going about global health financing and programming and think about how to make it more effective? I think obviously in the United States, everything that's happening with COVID is animating people around the idea of pandemic preparedness and health security. And I think those are going to be kind of operating themes going forward in the global health discussion in the United States. And I think for all of us, it's going to be really important to make sure we don't define preparedness and health security narrowly. We need to understand that for communities to respond to the health security threats they're facing now, and that includes diseases that kill millions of people every year, like AIDS, TB, and malaria, you need a strong health system. And when you're thinking about creating preparedness functions and laboratories that can be ready to do testing and respond to new disease threats, well, those laboratories are going to be more effective if they're being used right now to get services out to people. So, let's go forward, deal with this emergency, and also realize that we're kind of laying a foundation, I hope, for a more holistic approach to fighting infectious disease, and a way of being better prepared and advancing health security that is about meeting the needs of people right now, in addition to being prepared and realizing how connected a strong healthcare system is to both the immediate needs for people, but also to us, being able to respond to pandemics that come up.
Well, here we are at AIDS 2020 and HIV 2020, and Peter Sands from the Global Fund is, I think, part of the opening session for the HIV 2020 conference. But what has Friends got lined up for AIDS 2020? What are you doing?
I'm going to be watching a lot. And then there's a couple things that we're doing. For one, with the Global Fund, we're sponsoring an event on the Tuesday. It's going to actually be a partially live session on partnerships and going forward. And it's, kind of to your last question, how do we use this moment to think about the future and the kind of systems we want to create for the future in global health? And what does that mean for partnerships in terms of how civil society and the private sector and governments work together in a mutually beneficial way where everyone's playing to their strengths and we're supporting each other in a partnership model? What are the lessons of HIV for doing that? What does that have to mean in COVID, and how do we carry that forward into the future? That's one. And then another session that we're doing is based on a report we came out with AVAC and AMFAR last year, where we looked at 6 locations around the world that have been really successful against HIV, bringing down incidence and mortality. And we're looking at an update from 5 of those locations, how they've been doing over the last year in terms of those really, really effective responses. What are the lessons of that for other communities around the world, so that, you know, we can start demanding those kinds of great outcomes in HIV all over the world, not just in those 6 locations? And what does that mean in the era of COVID? Again, how do you seize this opportunity to use that HIV platform, move forward on the HIV goals, but also think about, you know, building systems that can respond to people's needs more broadly. So that's called How Did They Do It? And I think that's available all week long.
Well, wonderful. Chris, have a fantastic conference, and thank you for all the great work you and your team are doing. I mean, truly doing the Lord's work. Well, that's it for this episode of A Shot in the Arm podcast, brought to you by Livestream. Thanks to Erica Spera, our producer and director from Newsdoc Media. And thanks to you. As always, we'd love to know any questions or comments that you have. And you can find us at Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at Shot Arm Podcast. Have a great day and a safe day, everyone. And don't forget to wear your mask.